In December of 1975, inside Kodak's laboratory on Lake Avenue in Rochester, New York, a 24-year-old electrical engineer named Stephen Sasson pointed an 8-pound device at a technician standing near the door. The thing was the size of a toaster. Inside it were 16 nickel-cadmium batteries, a lens taken off a Super 8 movie camera, and a charge-coupled device chip made by Fairchild Semiconductor, the size of a fingernail that resolved 100 pixels by 100. Sasson pressed the switch. The machine captured the image in 50 milliseconds, then spent 23 seconds writing it onto a standard audio cassette. To see it, you fed that cassette into a custom reader wired to a television set, and half a minute later, a face assembled itself on the screen out of 10,000 gray dots. It was the first photograph in history taken without film. It was built inside the Eastman Kodak Company, the company that made more film than every other company on Earth combined. Kodak invented the digital camera, hid it to protect film, and died. That version gets taught in business schools on 4 continents as a textbook case of corporate failure, and it is wrong in the way that matters. Kodak did not hide it. Kodak patented it, funded it, and by 1991 was selling a digital camera to newspapers for $25,000 a unit. 6 years after Sasson's prototype, Kodak's own market intelligence department finished a study concluding that digital would replace film and told the board precisely how much time they had: 10 years. The forecast was right. In 1988, Kodak employed 145,300 people. On January 19, 2012, it filed for bankruptcy, listing $5.1 billion in assets against $6.75 billion in debt. This is not the story of a company that failed to see the future. It is the story of a company that saw it, measured it, wrote it down, and could not act on what it knew. What Clayton Christensen would later call the innovator's dilemma. We take apart the companies that shaped the world, down to the balance sheet and the people who signed it. Because the invention is only ever half the story. If this is your kind of thing, hit like and subscribe. What Kodak did with 30 years of advance notice is the other half. George Eastman left school at 14. His father had died. The family business in Rochester had gone down with him, and Eastman went to work as a messenger boy at $3 a week, then as a junior clerk at the Rochester Savings Bank. He was 23 and saving for a trip to Santo Domingo when a colleague suggested he photograph it. Eastman bought a complete wet plate outfit, a camera the size of a microwave oven, a tripod, glass plates, jugs of chemicals, and a tent to serve as a portable darkroom. The whole rig weighed about as much as a man could carry. He never took the trip. He took up photography instead. The problem was obvious to anyone who tried it once. A wet plate had to be coated, exposed, and developed while still wet, which meant the darkroom traveled wherever the camera did. Eastman read British photographic journals at night after the bank closed, and by 1878 he had a gelatin dry plate that could be coated in advance and developed whenever you got to it. In 1879, he built a machine to coat them in volume. In April of 1880, he leased the 3rd floor of a building on State Street and started manufacturing. In 1881, a family friend named Henry Strong, who made buggy whips for a living, put up the money, and the two of them formed the Eastman Dry Plate Company. By 1883, they were in the 4-story building at 343 State Street that is still the company's headquarters address today. Then Eastman did the thing that made everything else possible. He decided the product was not the plate. In 1888, he shipped a camera preloaded with a roll of flexible film long enough for 100 exposures. 1 shutter speed, 1 aperture, no viewfinder worth the name. $25. When you had shot all 100 frames, you mailed the entire camera back to Rochester, and Rochester developed your pictures, reloaded the camera, and mailed all of it back to you for $10. He needed a name. He wanted a word that was short, that could not be mispronounced in any language, and that meant nothing whatsoever in any of them. He was fond of the letter K, which he called a strong, incisive sort of letter, so he started there and finished there. Kodak. The advertising line ran 5 words. You press the button, we do the rest. That sentence is the entire company. Kodak was never in the camera business. The camera was the cost of entry, built as cheaply as it could be built, and the money lived in what the camera consumed: film, chemicals, paper, and the developing itself. Every photograph an American took sent a small payment to Rochester, and Rochester collected it twice, once for the film and once for the print. It is the razor and blades model, the same structure Gillette would make famous, and Kodak was running it a decade before Gillette sold a razor. In 1900, the company took the idea to its conclusion with the Brownie camera, a cardboard box wrapped in imitation leather, $1, marketed to children, with film at 15 cents a roll. A photograph stopped being something a professional did to you and became something you did. The factory behind it grew into something with no equivalent in American industry. Kodak Park, on the northwest side of Rochester, ran nearly 4 miles end-to-end across more than 1,300 acres, with over 150 manufacturing buildings, 30 miles of paved road, its own power plants, sewers, private railroad, medical clinic, and professional fire department. Kodak bought silver in quantities that moved the world price of the metal, because every frame of black and white film is silver suspended in gelatin, the silver halide process that underpinned the entire photographic industry. And in 1978, in a bunker beneath the basement of Building 82, behind 2 feet of concrete, Kodak switched on a small reactor holding 3.5 pounds of weapons-grade uranium, used to test chemicals for impurities. It ran for 29 years. Rochester learned it had existed in 2012, 5 years after it was dismantled. The research laboratory Eastman founded in 1912 under a British chemist named Kenneth Mies, one of the most influential figures in the history of photographic science, is why the moat held. In 1930, Mies hired 2 men who were not chemists. Leopold Mannis and Leopold Godowsky Jr. were working musicians, a pianist and a violinist who had been chasing color photography in a home laboratory since they were teenagers. Mies gave them a bench in Rochester and left them alone. They worked in complete darkness, and they timed the development stages by whistling the last movement of Brahms's First Symphony, because both of them knew exactly how long it ran. In 1935, they delivered Kodachrome. For the next 74 years, Kodachrome is what color memory looked like. It is the film in the Zapruder camera. It is most of the National Geographic archive. Paul Simon put it in the title of a top 5 record in 1973 and never had to explain the reference to anyone. By 1976, Kodak sold 90% of the film purchased in the United States and 85% of the cameras. Not the leader of the market, the market. The word Kodak did the work that the word photograph did. The physical shape of that is worth being exact about. Kodak's iconic yellow film box on the drugstore rack with the exposure count printed on the end. The counter where you handed the roll across and got a paper stub. The 3-day wait, or 1 hour if you paid for it. The envelope that came back with the prints in one pocket and the negatives in a paper sleeve in the other. And 4 frames ruined because somebody opened the back. 24 exposures meant deciding what was worth a photograph before you took it. That constraint was not a feature anyone designed. It was a side effect of the business model, and it shaped how a century of families remembered themselves. More than 60,000 of those 145,300 employees worked in Rochester. In 1996, revenue hit $16 billion. In 1999, profit peaked at $2.5 billion. Now go back to the room in Rochester in December of 1975. Sasson finished the prototype and did what an engineer does with one. He carried it around the building and demonstrated it to marketing, to the film division, to the business managers. He would photograph the people in the room without telling them, pull the cassette, walk it to the reader, and put their own faces on a television. What came back was not hostility. It was worse than hostility. Sasson has described it the same way for 50 years. They told him it was cute. and not to tell anybody about it. The question they actually asked him over and over was why anyone would want to take a picture this way when there was nothing wrong with the way pictures already got taken. In 1975, that is a reasonable question. The image was 10,000 gray dots. It took the better part of a minute to appear. There was no screen in a consumer's home that could display it, no way to move it anywhere, and no way to print it. Sasson's own estimate, worked out from the rate at which memory density was improving, was that the technology needed 15 to 20 years before anyone would buy it. He was right about that too. So Kodak filed the patent in 1978 and went back to work. You can read that decision two ways, and honest history holds both at once. From one angle, a company declining to demolish an 80% margin business for a product that would not exist for 2 decades is not blindness, it is arithmetic. From the other, Kodak held the largest concentration of imaging science on the planet and spent its warning defending a position instead of building a replacement. Both readings are true. The second one is what killed it. Because in 1981, the warning stopped being a guess. Vince Baraba ran market intelligence at Kodak, and with the chief executive backing him, he commissioned a study of silver halide against digital imaging, the underlying technologies, the cost curves, the likely adoption rates. It came back in 2 halves. The bad news was that digital was entirely capable of replacing film. The good news was that it would take about 10 years to get there. Kodak had a decade of runway and a written map of the ground. The decade went like this. In 1984, the Los Angeles Olympics needed an official film sponsor. Peter Ueberroth flew to Rochester to offer it to Kodak, where it obviously belonged. Kodak's advertising people negotiated and would not pay $1 million against Ueberroth's $4 million floor. So Ueberroth went to a Japanese company almost no American had heard of, and Fujifilm said yes on the spot and eventually paid around $7 million. Fuji put its green boxes on the shelf beside Kodak's yellow ones and priced underneath them. Within 30 months, Fuji's American film sales were up 30%. Kodak had handed a competitor its own home market to save $3 million. In 1985, a federal court found that Kodak had infringed 7 Polaroid patents on instant photography. In January of 1986, the injunction landed, and Kodak walked out of the instant business overnight. A $200 million line closed, the plant shut, and 16.5 million instant cameras already sitting in American homes turned into objects with no film. In 1990, the damages were set at $909 million, the largest patent award in American history to that point. In 1988, Kodak spent $5.1 billion buying Sterling Drug, a pharmaceutical company, on the theory that chemistry is chemistry. It sold the pieces off 6 years later at a loss. That was the 10 years. Here's the fact that breaks the myth for good. Kodak did not sit digital out. Kodak built a 1.3 megapixel CCD sensor and in May of 1991 shipped the Kodak DCS, a Nikon F3 body with a Kodak digital back bolted onto it. The first commercially available digital SLR in the world, $20,000 to $25,000, sold to newspapers and wire services. It moved 987 units in 3 years, and every professional digital camera since descends from it. George Fisher, a former Motorola chief executive, arrived in 1993 as the first outsider ever to run the company, and said plainly that Kodak was not a film company, but an imaging company. Antonio Perez came from Hewlett-Packard in 2005 and bet the enterprise on digital cameras and inkjet printing. And it worked, briefly, in the way that hurts most. In 2005, Kodak was the #1 seller of digital cameras in the United States, with sales up 40% to $5.7 billion. Kodak lost money on nearly every one of them. That is the sentence the case studies leave out. A roll of film was a consumable at better than 70% margin, sold to the same customer every month for a lifetime. A digital camera was a durable good at commodity margin, sold once to a customer who then bought nothing. No film, no processing, no prints. This is the core of what Clayton Christensen diagnosed in The Innovator's Dilemma. Disruptive innovation doesn't just kill a product, it kills the business model underneath it. Kodak did not need to invent digital photography. It had already done that. Kodak needed digital photography to have a business model underneath it, and there was never one there. By 2007, the company had fallen to fourth in American digital camera sales with 9.6%. Between 2004 and 2007, it closed 13 film plants and 130 photo finishing labs and eliminated roughly 50,000 jobs. In 2004, Kodak came off the Dow Jones Industrial Average after 74 years on it. In 2009, it ended Kodachrome after 74 years of that. In 2010, it came out of the S&P 500. Kodachrome's chemistry was difficult enough that by the end, exactly one laboratory on Earth still ran the process: Dwayne's Photo, on a corner in Parsons, Kansas. Steve McCurry took the last roll Kodak manufactured, shot it over 2 months, and sent it to Kansas. Dwayne's stopped accepting Kodachrome on December 30th, 2010. The final roll through the machine was shot by the owner, Dwayne Steinley, and processed on January 18, 2011. Photographers had driven across several states to make the deadline. On January 19, 2012, Eastman Kodak filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the Southern District of New York. $5.1 billion in assets, $6.75 billion in debts, 17,000 employees left worldwide. To fund the bankruptcy, it sold roughly 1,100 imaging patents for about $525 million to a consortium including Apple, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Samsung, and Adobe. The company that invented the digital camera sold the intellectual property of digital photography to the companies that had eaten it at a price the bankers had originally estimated in the billions. It emerged on September 3, 2013, as a commercial printing company. What happened next is stranger. In 2018, Kodak licensed its name to a cryptocurrency and a Bitcoin mining rig, neither of which went anywhere. In July of 2020, a federal agency announced interest in lending Kodak $765 million to make generic drug ingredients. The stock rose more than 1,000% in 2 days, inquiries followed, reviewers concluded the process had been proper, and the loan never proceeded. And meanwhile, quietly, the oldest thing in the building started selling again. Film photography came back, not as an industry, as a choice. Directors wrote it into their contracts, and a generation that had never used it went hunting for secondhand cameras, because a photograph you cannot see immediately is worth something precisely because you cannot see it immediately. Kodak has put $60 million into the coating plant at Rochester and raised output 18%. The finishing lines run 24 hours a day. Half the manufacturing workforce has been hired in the last 3 years. In 2025, the company took in $1.069 billion, and it is the third largest manufacturer in Rochester now, with about 1,300 people there. George Eastman saw none of it. In 1932, at 77, with a degenerative spinal condition that had reduced him to a shuffle and had killed his mother slowly in a wheelchair, he called in his lawyer and witnesses, revised his will, asked them to leave the room, and shot himself. He left a note on the pad beside him. "To my friends, my work is done. Why wait?" His work was a system for taking the photograph away from the people who had specialized in it and handing it to everybody else. That system ran for 120 years, and the thing that ended it was built in his own buildings by a 24-year-old who was told not to tell anyone. In November of 2009, Stephen Sasson stood in the East Room of the White House and received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. Kodak filed for bankruptcy 26 months later. Somewhere in a closet, in a house that has changed hands twice, there is a shoebox holding 100 paper envelopes, and inside each one a strip of orange negatives in a sleeve that nobody has held up to a window in 30 years. Nothing on a phone has replaced what that box does, which is to be a fixed and finite record of a family, chosen 24 frames at a time by somebody who had to decide what mattered before they pressed the button. Kodak did not lose because it could not see what was coming. It saw it in 1975, measured it in 1981, built it in 1991, and led the American market for it in 2005. It lost because the future it built was worth less than the past it was replacing, and no amount of foresight fixes that. Joseph Schumpeter called it creative destruction, the process by which new technologies don't just beat old ones, they erase the economics that made them profitable. Kodak is its most complete example. There was never a version of this where the yellow box won. If you shot Kodachrome, worked a shift at Kodak Park, or still have that shoebox, drop a comment below. Tell us the film, the camera, and the year. And if there is a roll in a drawer you never developed, say so, because somebody in the comments will tell you where to send it. The people who ran the coding machines and the people who filled the albums know more about what was lost than the executives who sold the patents. Subscribe because this archive is still growing. We have the story of another American empire coming next. And like Kodak, like Blockbuster, like Nokia, it saw exactly what was coming and still could not stop it. You will not want to miss